All right. So Cadell asked me to speak on the Wisdom Commons. And the Wisdom Commons has been a phrase that's associated with the Stoa, a space that an online space that I steward. And yeah, so I'll come back to this term, but that's sort of the premise of today's talk, is for me to discuss the Wisdom Commons. And so what's a Stoa, the place that the Wisdom Commons has been associated with? And for those of you who are just discovering the Stoa right now or watching on YouTube and don't know what it's about, brief history. So pre-COVID, I did this podcast called the Intellectual Explorers Podcast, sort of a dorky title, which I'm not a big fan of. And I had this Stoicism group in Toronto, Stoicism Toronto, and it was quite large. And then COVID happened, fell out of love doing the podcast, and I couldn't meet in person, obviously, because the lockdowns were in place. And so I kind of fused these two things together, the podcast and the meetup group, and then the Stoa was born on March 21st, 2020. And we had big names like Noam Chomsky, ContraPoints, Curtis Yarvin, the late James Cars, who wrote Finite Infinite Games. And the Stoa was known for sort of what they call transperspectival approach. It was hard to kind of pattern match it in one philosophy, ideology, or mimetic tribe, as I like to call it. But more so than featuring big names, it's like a new breed of philosophers emerged. And the Stoa sort of helped find and highlight and boost the signal of these new philosophers. Raven Connolly, who I think is in the room today, Patrick Ryan, Evan McMullen, Cheryl Shu, and then emerging philosophers like Alex Eber, Cadell Last, kind of highlighted their work. And one of the themes of the Stoa was exploring what we'll call hyperobjects. So hyperobjects is a term from Timothy Morton's book, which quite influenced me. And to put it simply, it's objects that are so big that they move outside of temporal and spatial boundaries. And so Timothy Morton uses examples of global warming, capitalism, nuclear war, potentially. So these are hyperobjects. And something about hyperobjects feels cool for me when I kind of got introduced to this term. It was psychoactive, because it's like I could feel, not just think about these things in an abstract way, but feel these things as living entities, these hyperobjects, and what they do to my body and how can I relate with them. And so the Stoa and adjacent spaces, one of the hyperobjects that they were sensing into was the meta crisis. This has a bunch of terms like the polycrisis, omnicrisis, mega crisis, permacrisis, or Alexander Bard less pretentiously just called it the crisis. And what is the meta crisis? I'll explain that in a moment, but just the working assumption is that the meta crisis is the highest leverage hyperobject to sense into and to get into relationship with, because it's sort of like the hyperobject that encapsulates and includes all other sort of unpleasant, let's say, hyperobjects. And so what is the meta crisis? And here's a graphic that I picked up from the game B space. You can say the meta crisis is an ecology of existential risks, crises that could happen, crises, I should say. So like supply chain fragility, climate change, alienation, the meaning crisis, catastrophic risk. So it's like this confluence of existential risks, and they're interrelated, and you can't just look at one in isolation and try to solve it. And at the Stoa, like in 2020, no one was really talking about the meta crisis. I felt like we were the only ones that were focusing on this and viewing it as an important thing. But then recently, it's become mainstream. The permacrisis was declared the word of the year. And the Davos class itself, the World Economic Forum, they've been running with the polycrisis as a phrase, and they released a report last year talking about all the existential risks that we're faced with. So why care about something like the meta crisis? Because the two main attractors, if this is not responded to with sufficient wisdom, is attractor one, they say, is sort of something chaotic could emerge. No one's in control, breakdown of civilization. And the prepper community calls this without rule of law. But then the other attractor is oppression. Governments become totalitarian, or the prepper calls this excessive rule of law. And there's a term called elite panic. So when you kind of like, since all these crises happens, more control happens, and you kind of you can make the argument that this has been happening in the COVID moment. But the third attractor, global coordination, and some people refer to this as game B, the game B option. Maybe from a leftist perspective, it's a fully automated luxury communism, or to speak more poetically, Charles Eisenstein calls it the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. But the thing is, like, how are you going to deal with all this shit, all this meta-crisis stuff, when there's a culture war happening? So this is another hyperobject that we were sensing into at the Stoa and adjacent spaces. And one thing about the culture war is one of these phrases gets thrown around. Either if you don't agree with the person, you're either too stupid, too brainwashed, too egoic or narcissistic, or too evil or beyond the pale to engage in conversation with. And you can understand the culture war in many different ways, but I'm going to understand it as a war of sacred values. So the best definition of values from Joe Edelman, in my opinion, is attentional protocols. And so it's like a value, put your attention on certain aspects of reality. And so this is like a value cloud, like, you know, truth, love, power, success, whatever your value is, you're going to, you know, put your attention toward that. And this notion of sacred values, which I believe I got from cultural anthropology, are protected values that are absolute and cannot be transgressed by a group. So the culture war, one way to look at it, is a war of sacred values. And here's a graphic I pulled up from Wikipedia, and then like kind of an adjacent term to sacred values is intrinsic value. So you can look at a lot of philosophies that exist, and they all have sacred values that orient their attention. So feminism, gender equality, hedonism, pleasure, utilitarianism, utility or happiness or pleasure, you can say as well. Buddhism, enlightenment, nihilism, nothing. And so it's like you have these values, attentional protocols, and all this intellectual philosophical architecture gets built around it to support that attention. It's almost like existential horse blinders get put on the person once they adopt a certain philosophy. And I did this report, I think in 2018, called Mimetic Tribes of Culture War 2.0. And I made the argument that the culture war is not just like left and right, it's a multipolar war of different mimetic tribes, which are like philosophies that are living on the internet or the noosphere or the global brain. So this is back in 2018. Black Lives Matter, the sacred value there is restorative justice, Antifa, freedom from fascists, dirtbag left, economic justice. You got the intellectual dark web, free speech, the alt-right, white ethnic survival, manosphere, masculinity. So all these mimetic tribes, these living philosophies on the internet, again, they had these attentional protocols looking at certain aspects of reality and then fighting and arguing with each other. And one, you know, the popular thing to say is the blind man and the elephant. It's like the elephant represents reality, and all these people, the mimetic tribe philosophies, with their attentional protocols, are looking at an aspect of the elephant, thinking it's the whole thing, and then arguing with someone else about it. And I think a better way to describe it, rather than the elephant and the blind man and the elephant, is the Spider-Man meme. It's like everyone's like pointing at each other, and like, okay, why worry about the culture war? Back to meta crisis. So we have all this stuff that we have to deal with, and we got like Spider-Man meme happening. That's not good, because it could lead to one of these two attractors, these hellish attractors. And that is the argument. And so within the Stoa, and I think about a year ago, this is emergent kind of consensus amongst a certain cohort of people is that wisdom or emergent wisdom is the thing that is needed to address not just the meta crisis, but the culture war. And what is wisdom? So referencing the Joe Edelman's attentional protocol definition and bringing in Igor Grossman's definition of wisdom, he's a researcher in Toronto, a psychological researcher in Toronto that studies wisdom. And he defines it as the meta value that adjudicates between all other values. So if wisdom is your value or central value, then in theory, then you have the capacity to zoom out from all the values at play and put your attention on it when it is quote unquote wise to do so. And he was part of a wisdom, Toronto Wisdom Task Force with John Vervaeke, who did the Meaning Crisis was a part of as well. So all these kind of psychologists who were studying wisdom, they came up with that definition that I just presented, but they also said this kind of like the talent stack or the skill stack of wisdom is perspectival metacognition. It's the ability to balance viewpoints, to be epistemic, to have epistemic humility, to have the capacity to adapt to context, and aka deal with uncertainty, and then take multiple perspectives. So again, it's that zooming out approach, and then really sort of embodying the value if needed. And this is something like takes a lot of work, in my opinion, not only to kind of pass someone's like what's it called? They call it ideological Turing test. If you meet someone, it's like, could you actually trick them to believe that you're part of their tribe? Like most people can't do that, right? But that's one thing. The other thing is actually embodying the emotional reality of someone's worldview and then the values that they hold. A lot of people can't do that either. So there's that kind of inability to have an actual, real, authentic, emergent conversation. But I think people who are attracted to the Stoa and this emerging wisdom commons is this desire to have that capacity, not only go like hyper meta and take all these different perspectives, but actually be in your body and really feel the intensity of holding an alternative view. So this wisdom web is emerging, and I'll show some players in there. So John Vervaeke, Benita Roy, some people call them the Scholarks, Nathan Vanderpool, who does Respond, Dana Thorson, who does Emerge podcast, and Cheryl Shu. It's like there's this wisdom web emerging who are operating under the belief that wisdom, bringing wisdom back in public consciousness is the thing that is needed, and the practices that come along with it. And going back to this notion of hyperobjects, like we invited Timothy Morton to come to Stoa, and he agreed, and he canceled last minute. So we just had like a conversation, free associative conversation, and it was great. And one thing that got pointed out is that the book, while really good, it was very pessimistic. All the hyperobjects that Timothy Morton was focusing on was like like world-ending sort of hyperobjects. So it didn't lead. After reading the book, you weren't like inspired. You were sort of just kind of like felt defeated in your body. And then we're talking about, okay, what about like more life-affirming hyperobjects? And we started talking about like midwifing, birthing a hyperobject into an existence. And then this idea of the wisdom commons. Could we birth a hyperobject into existence that responds to all these other hyperobjects that are at play? And the wisdom commons I simply defined as a place that makes wisdom more common. And I'd argue that it's already here. Wisdom commons is already here in Substacks and Discords, in Telegram groups and forums, in dark forests like the Stoa or Philosophy Portal, and in IRL in real life. I think there's a great hunger not only to take multiple perspectives, but really search for the truth. And so I think this movement of this like para-academic philosophers, and returning to philosophy as a love of wisdom, I think is coming back into public consciousness. So my approach to the Wisdom Commons is fourfold. It's in relationships, not in propositions. I think there's going to be multiple Wisdom Commons emerging and competing with each other. I think it's wiser to focus on being less foolish rather than being more wise or appearing more wise, because I think this avoids wisdom signaling. So if you talk about wisdom too much, then people think, oh, you're this wise person, when I think when you actually orient towards wisdom, you realize how ridiculously foolish you are. And the last one, perhaps most provocatively, is to treat the Wisdom Commons as a work of art, as a collective work of art that we are creating together. Yeah, and that's it. That's the end of my slides. So yeah, I'm open to thank you. I'm open to how you think it's best to proceed, Cadell.
No, I love that presentation. So I'll say a few things, but please, if you have questions for Peter, raise your hand. We'll get to them. We have a lot of time for conversation, which is great, because I think there's a lot of material on here that would be great for questions, reflections, and so forth. But that gave me, I had never really had a conceptual overview of what was going on at the Stoa. Like, I could intuit like a lot of what you were saying, but like that gave a conceptual clarity to like what was really driving the Stoa at its core. And I'm extremely appreciative of that overview. So I guess if no one's raising their hand yet, yeah, just please raise your hand if you do have a question. But my first thing is where are you now with this concept of the hyperobject? I mean, it seems like an infinitely useful concept in some sense. It's like, you know, the things related to like global warming or capitalism, or in the paper I sent to you on global commons and the global brain, I have this idea of the commons gap, where there's just like these, you know, different categories of wicked problems, which are just they can't really think about them in a problem solution type of way. They're just kind of like, they're here now and they're probably going to be here for the whole century.
Well, one thing when you focus on the hyperobject, and I do agree, like conceptually, it's a really high leverage hyperobject to focus on the meta crisis. But like two things happen. You get fear put in your body. Because like you think about the worst case scenario and like, oh shit, what do I do? And there's not just a meta crisis in the world, there's a meta crisis of your life too. You know, like you have relationships with your family, you can't pay the taxes, you got health problems. Like, how do I address all these like global issues if I can't even like effectively address the meta crisis of my life? So it brings fear in your body. It makes you incredibly humble because there's massive complexity that you just don't know how to respond to. And I actually think those are like good things to get into relationship with, that fear in your body and that humility that's needed, which is related to the kind of like one of the traits of wisdom. And there's something about art that I think is quite important, because I know I can't create art. And one way I kind of understand art, and I view Stoa as my artwork, is that there's something kind of like almost spiritual, or I call it the daemon, that just channels through you, that has to be expressed, that has to be created, like that creative impulse. But when there's fear in my body, especially unexamined fear, I can't create anything. And so getting to that state where, like courage, in a way, one of the cardinal virtues, to create your art, I think is quite critical. And I think it's a fear-based response by thinking what it's going to look like. What's this Wisdom Commons going to look like, right? Like what's the building? What's the structure? How we're going to coordinate everything? It's like, I think that is a fool's errand because I don't think if it's truly emergent, we're not going to know how it's going to look like. So for me, and my disposition is just, I'm just going to create art. I might be a total fool. I might be totally wrong, but I'm going to bet on this thing, this kind of a creative impulse and then direction that it's taking me.
I love that. And yeah, I hope there'll be enough time for me to come back around on that, but let's get to Max and then Thomas. Max, go ahead.
Yeah, very good. Very interesting projects, Peter. What do you think is the difference between the Stoa and what happened with the intellectual dark web with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan? That seemed to fizzle out or break down. Was there pitfalls or wrong directions do you think that they made that made it break down? Was it people that were really united, not in a shared value, but just against something?
Well, I don't know if it broke down. That's an interesting inquiry, because they're still around. They're not like might not be hanging out with each other in Zoom rooms all the time, but they're still around as a force in culture, like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and I think a lot of them are still focused on pushing back on this kind of woke thing that's emerging, and so. Yeah, I can spend a lot of time looking at all their faults, but maybe from a utilitarian lens, it's like, oh, maybe that is doing some kind of good by pushing back on this woke force and culture, the pathological versions of this woke force, but sort of as I think like one of the things that you're pointing at is like the failure mode of maybe how should I word this, like the promise of the intellectual dark web when it originally started. It was like, oh, it's going to be talking about like we're going to be emergent thinking, we're going to be free associative philosophers, free thinkers, but then it kind of like just, I don't know, fossilized their thinking. And I think part of that is broadcast media. It was like this asynchronous approach to doing philosophies. Like they either talk to someone on the podcast or they're communicating and then they broadcast it out to a bunch of people, which has some utility, but something that we're doing right here, right now at the Stoa philosophy portal is we're actually talking oftentimes when it's not recorded. And when you can do that, you can get really fucking messy. You don't have to worry about your reputation. You don't have to worry about getting canceled, all this type of stuff. You don't have to worry about getting attacked, trolled, whatever, harassed. So I think something there plays a factor in what happened to the intellectual dark web, which is something that I'm trying to avoid with this.
Yeah, I like Peterson. I like a lot of the people that are in that group, but I mean Sam, and there was a whole thing with Brett Weinstein. They can't even talk to one another now. It gets to a certain level where the epistemic communication just breaks down. And in some cases, even having the conversation or beginning the conversation is a problem. It seems to go beyond for Sam. He seems to see Brett and some of people like Jordan that they're actually spreading disinformation. So I suppose what I would say is I agree with you, it felt as if that IDW could have been something much deeper, and they were captured by the whole anger, which is completely understandable, of the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I think I don't see it as a bad thing, what happened though. Sort of like just a lesson for people who don't want to repeat it.
Exactly.
And I can go like kind of geek out on culture war analysis all day. Like I do find it fascinating how there was a kind of unified front against sort of woke, and then the COVID moment happened, and sort of the heterodox sphere, the intellectual dark web split, I should say, into sort of the anti-vax or the more conspiratorial, and then the one that was more kind of pro-science. So it's interesting to see like the Venn diagram of their belief space and how like they were fighting against each other. This is why I think it's a multipolar perspective of the culture war should be taken. But yeah, I think it's like a cool thing to happen, and we can learn lessons and analyze it and not make the same mistakes.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, Thomas.
Yeah, Wicked, thank you, because I've actually never really watched your work, but I know Cadell's mentioned it a few times, so thanks for the overview. Just my question is actually quite similar to Max's in terms of maybe what Max just said about like the epistemic quality like the intellectual dark web, like the foundations from which they begin the discourse, in which they continue it with. Because what I liked in your presentation was what I think you call PMC, which is like the quality or character of the wisdom that you try to bring forth. And like something I like is the fact that it's multifaceted, like there's a manifold participation of different perspectives, and it's the attitude within which you play forward into that space. So my question was like, do you see kind of like any philosophical groundings to do with art in that space? Because the way that so there's a book that came out recently which is called Outspoken. It's like a series of essays that's engaged with like emergencies. So that one of the editors follows Heidegger, whose fate, I have it actually written down, I just saw it. Let me find this because it's quite important to quote. So Heidegger says, okay, I'm not going to find it quickly, but basically it's like the emergence. So the way this person translates it is like the emergency of not considering emergencies. It's like the distress of not being in distress when we come to what's happening, like what hyperobjects or metacrises. But he wrote a book called like Why Only Art Can Save Us. So he talks about the quality of art is a kind of, so he follows Heidegger's thinking, like it exposes you to maybe like the nothingness or the clearing within which you take skepticism into your framings. The way that you experience yourself and the world is like there's like a heavy skepticism where you say like, this is my way of participating, I'm very aware of this. So the quality itself is one which is more like, and this maybe goes to my presentation, like a let be quality, where you say, okay, like there are emergencies, but the only way that we're going to talk about this is to give space to see how wisdom itself speaks. But I was just wondering if like you can see any connection with art, because you said like the way you practice the art and you frame it around art. Do you see that art has a different quality rather than just becoming one of the ideologies, you know? Because someone could easily say like, oh yeah, but you're just one sector of the whole framework which is trying to respond, you know? I think maybe there's a question of quality which is different from maybe the intellectual dark web, because that became too angry, too tense, too solidified maybe, rather than being more discursive and open.
And you could say the intellectual dark web wasn't really artful, you know, a lot of the time, and it's not. There's this phrase that I really love. Consensus beats truth. Consensus beats truth all the time, but beauty beats consensus. So if something is really beautiful, then it's like people are going to be drawn to it whether they like it or not. And I think that's the role of art, is to, you know, create beauty. And you know, I can get really theoretical about what is art and like why is it important, stuff like that. But it's like, quite simply for me, is like when I feel like I'm creating art, there's a sense of channeled quality, and there's a sense of like really deep aliveness that just justifies itself. So if the world's ending tomorrow, I want to be creating art until I die, you know, because then that sense of aliveness has a timeless quality as well. So there's something about art that feels quite radical, because it doesn't need to be justified. And when you do, then it stops becoming art, and it's not artful. And there's also an intuition that like if we, and like Pierre Hadot, you know, the guy who did philosophy as a way of life, he called the original philosophers like the Stoics as artists of life. And so I think if we have this artist of life approach, it's going to be quite surprising what emerges. It's not going to be obvious. It's not going to be only, it will be theoretical. There could be a theoretical portion for it, but it's not going to only be theoretical, which I think what happened to the intellectual dark web.
Yeah, wicked. Thanks.
Danny?
Hello, all. I'm just pulling together the art and also the intellectual dark web, all that's playing with there. Some of the wisdom, some of the art seems to be about how to actually communicate between different, that whole list, Peter, that you have, right? All the different tribes. And that itself is an art, right? When the minute you said that Turing test and then the somatic, that is an art, and the art of relating, right? The art of, can you and I, who are completely different, can we meet and grow something, make something new happen, right? So, and that's related to Wisdom Commons in some way, because I think there was something else you said about the Wisdom Commons also needs to be networking out. You know, there's going to be pockets and pods, but so then how do the pods interact? That also feels like an art, right? And, you know, Jeremy Johnson, he's constantly talking about this mycorrhizal way of interacting, you know, that you have your tentacles out. And I have two pieces that I want to just bring forth. One is that I saw somewhere that this may even have, I don't know if this was the Nobel Laureates Summit, which just happened, where the scientists somebody was saying what scientists need to do is I don't cross describe each other. In other words, I'm in one discipline, and now I want you to listen to me. It's kind of like that Turing, but it's different. I want you to listen to me from your discipline, and I want you to describe for me what you hear and what you see and what the questions are that are in your discipline, not in mine, right? But just what do I see differently, right? You know, it's the other lens, the other vantage point. And that really struck me as, you know, how do we get this bridge to happen? And I'm going to even make it wider. The Wisdom Commons, I've just been reading about people talking about populism, right? What's the difference between Wisdom Commons and populism, right? Is this about bridging is it about staying in pockets where we can be grokked, where we get each other? What is the bridging? Is it a question, again, of an art to be able to bring it into a wider culture? So play with that.
So what comes up, and a few people know, like Raven, I think Cadell knows that Jordan Peterson was my therapist before he became culture war famous. And part of the reason why I was so interested in the culture war was watching him just rise and seeing everyone look at him, especially in the beginning too. It was like he was such an anomaly, and no one could kind of like pattern match him. And it really informed my analysis on the culture war, just seeing how everyone kind of like understood him. And then I started doing these philosophy groups in Toronto, and it's just like, Toronto's such an interesting place because there's like all these people, there's just men, right activists, new atheists, kind of woke types, rationalists, and you put them together in a room. And I had these like kind of like discussion groups in person, and everyone was just talking past each other. It felt really schizophrenic. Yeah, but I really loved it. They didn't enjoy it. It was like frustrating, but I loved it as kind of like an amateur anthropologist. And quite consciously, I approached the Stoa the way I did, to invite all these different voices in to see what it does to my body, to see how I get triggered. And I can map, you know, I have strong Stoic emotional regulation, so I can kind of like get disembodied and map their propositions. But it's a different game than just staying in my body when they're coming with a certain energy and certain worldviews, and I get triggered. And then I have to get into right relationship with getting triggered. And I found with in-person groups and then with the Stoa is that dealing with the culture war and the diversity of viewpoints was an amazing individuation exercise. It was actually better therapy, much better therapy than I had the 2 years with Jordan Peterson. Yes, I feel like engaging with this in the way when you engage it with your body and then the emotions that happen, then processing those emotions, great wisdom comes from that, because it's almost like you become psychic if you can read someone's body. If you can read your body, you can read their body, and then you're speaking in a different language almost. You're speaking in the language of vibes, and you can kind of use sort of phrases that they use in a way that still maintains integrity with your viewpoint, because you're not lying, you're not bullshitting. So I think it gives you more artistry to talk to a variety of people with different viewpoints when you approach it in this way. This is a more embodiment approach. And that was one of the other themes of the Stoa is embodiment. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think the more people who get like skilled in this will be the bridge builders.
Just punctuate one thing. What you're describing is what an artist would do regardless of the what do we call it? Can't think of the word. The medium, whatever it is, whether it's paint, whether it's words, whether it's music, right? They are playing with the energies, what you're just talking about, playing with the memes. So they have a different relationship. They're not guarding something. They're not saying, I have to prove. Artists are not proving. Doesn't feel like to me. So yeah, it's good. Thank you.
All right, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to think, I like treating conversations as art. And I think a lot of people who are in like the podcast scene, at least in this space, that they have that approach as well.
All right, we're going to go with Raven first, and then we'll go to you, Max, because Raven hasn't asked yet.
Hi, Peter.
Hey, Raven.
Great presentation. It was so awesome to go back and think about the beginning of the Stoa and all the places that we've been since its origins. One of the things I was thinking about over the course of your presentation was how the game B, like third attractor wave, also kind of crested and has been dissipating. And we've also actually seen the meta crisis continue to unfold. We're seeing global supply chains break down, all the kind of manifestations, the footprints of the hyperobject, as Timothy Wynne would say, are kind of manifesting themselves in reality. And we're beginning to see more of how things are going to unfold. So I'm curious, where is your thinking now? Are you beyond those concepts? Is that what you mean when you say working from a place of emergence and, being in the process of creating art, to kind of what is the wave of concepts or of frames that we can use going forward to contextualize this crisis? The other thing that I will just throw in before you answer that is the negative space of this whole meta crisis, because there's like a massive filter that we're going through, and some things are being left behind and some things may pass through the filter. So I also wonder about how you think of the negative space in terms of conceiving of where we are and how we're moving into the future.
Well, I'll respond, but I am curious what your thoughts are on that, because I think you have more wisdom than I do and probably have better thinking than I do in that regard. Like, I was never like a game beer meta-modernist, those are like a post-rationalist, like those are sort of like meta tribes that I kind of resonated with in the beginning of the Stoa, and maybe we highlighted more of them. But I agree with you that they kind of like, especially game B and then meta-modernism, there's like had more of a spark and there's less so now. And even though I kind of agree with a lot of the moves, the propositional moves they did, but it's just kind of like dorky, too obvious, right? It's like you're not going to create a movement based off of terms like that. So that's one reason why I think that kind of just faded. And my other thinking is that like, it's going to be really gritty. Things are going to get really gritty. Right? It's going to get just really like weird and messy and fucked up. So it's not going to like, you can't follow a clean manual on what to do. And I think wisdom is sort of like the art of navigating complexity without a goal sometimes, because we might have a broad goal, but like the goal, what we actually should do concretely as a person right now, often like how do you respond? So having this kind of like almost backwards approach where you're just following a certain creative energy, the artistic impulse, is a thing I'm betting on. And the concepts that could emerge from it, I'm excited to find out. You and I are going to do like a series at what I'm doing. So it's like, what's in the middle? Usually what's in the middle, something emerges. And so right now what's emerging is, for me at least, is this wisdom commons thing. and it might be dorky eventually or too obvious, and then something else I'll run with something else. But right now it's kind of like, I like this attractor to move toward, to see what emerges from it. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I am curious what your thoughts are, if we have time, Cadell.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to open up more time, because and we're going to push back each presentation a little bit, because that's going to actually work better in the context of the whole night. And I think there's enough space here to discuss for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes, if that's okay. So if you wanted to expand any more on that point, Raven, or if you want to continue that dialogue, we can, or I'll go to the next person.
Yeah, I mean, I think the filter, the negativity is where a lot of, because with the hyperobject, right, there's like thinking of presence, but then there's also thinking the absence. And in terms of conceiving of the future, what will no longer be there, right? Of course, coming at this from even just like a population perspective, right? It's a really concrete way of imagining what the future will hold, because there will be an absence, a very palpable absence of young people in the future, and of certain cultures and populations. So that's one way of making this concrete, but that's not the only negativity. I guess one of the primary negativities that is in the culture now is like extinction on the level of like species, but we rarely extrapolate that to extinction on the level of human beings and human culture. And it seems to me like this filter that we're going through is extremely brutal and is going to eliminate a lot of things. And that will require being brave in the way you described, just to be in contact with how severe this transition is looking like it's going to be. So yeah, those are my thoughts and perspectives, just in brief. And I think we'll probably be exploring like, okay, yeah, but what's the practical level of this in our series for Less Foolish? But if you have anything to respond, I would love to hear.
Yeah, and there's a part of me that really enjoys that kind of that grittiness of what's unfolding, because it just kind of clarifies a lot of things of what's really important. And like, it's for me right now, it's my wife, it's my family, my parents are getting older, I got to take care of things. It's like the practicality of making money, but then still moving to this new world. And there's this old book called Survival of the Wisest, which I quite like. And everyone has to have a strategy, something they bet on. And so I'm betting on wisdom. And if I become wise enough, maybe I'll survive. maybe I won't. We'll see. But yeah, but that's the thing I'm betting on.
All right, let's go to Max, and then we'll go to Jorge.
This hyperobjects are very interesting. It reminds me of Baudrillard. I don't know if you've ever read him, one of the French postmodernists. And he wrote several books, Simulacrum and Simulation, inspired The Matrix, and then the Gulf War did not happen. But the main thing that I find interesting with Baudrillard is his argument about the time that we live in, where according to his argument, we can't tell the difference between the simulation and actual reality. So there's an article that I put into the chat here. I'll just read a little quote from the article. The campaigns, this is in regards to campaigns that the UK government did after terror attacks. The campaigns have been deployed during every UK terrorist attack incident in recent years, including the London Bridge attack in 2017, the Finsbury Mosque attack that took place 2 weeks later. Within hours of the incident, campaigns were swiftly organised with I-Heart protesters designed and distributed according to the location of attacks. Plans are also drawn up from people to hand out flowers at the scene of the crime and apparently unprompted gestures of love and support. The purpose of the operations, according to the number of people Sorry, one second. My granddad's coming out.
Good old granddad. You saw the flash of the granddad.
It's what always happens when I'm on a call. So the purpose of the operations, according to a number of people involved in their creation who spoke to the Middle Eastern Eye, is to shape public responses, encouraging individuals to focus on empathy for the victims and sense a unity within strangers rather than reacting with violence and anger. Now, I can completely understand why the UK government would implement such a thing. But this is the simulation or social media has become our reality. You know, with the war in Ukraine at the moment, it's very hard to tell actually what is going on because there's information campaigns going from each side. And when Baudrillard was writing, when he was born after World War II, and in his work he talks about the Monet Plan, where after World War II they drew up the Monet Plan, and then reality fit into the Monet Plan. So Europe was rebuilt with the Monet Plan, was rebuilt on a simulation. Do you think this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to think properly about hyperobjects, or is it just the sheer scale of a hyperobject?
I don't know, but I want to kind of take a crack at responding to some of the stuff you said about well, I'll use like kind of a Guy Debord's term, the spectacle, like how to get into a right relationship with the spectacle. And it's another way to look at the culture war is like this gaslighting writ large. And the way I kind of, understand gaslighting is when someone tries to undermine your sense of reality and impose another sense of reality. And one thing, my project I've been doing is being really attuned with my body when I feel like I'm being manipulated and being put out of my kind of sovereignty. So I think that's a really cool like literacy. It's like a spectacle literacy, and then knowing when you're being gaslit. And this is might be a little kind of crazy thought, but I'll share it anyway. So all of the mimetic tribes and kind of philosophies I investigated, there's this term called ontological flooding, where you actually just allow the worldview just to flood your body, right? And so you actually feel like you see the world through that mimetic tribes, through that, like, that person touching that elephant. One of the interesting one is conspiracy theory mimetic tribes, because you end up not trusting anything. And I got to a point where I just like, am I an MK Ultra agent? I didn't trust anyone. It was temporary, but it just brought some like real interesting sanity. But then on the other side of that, it actually felt like a rite of passage. And Robert Anton Wilson kind of talks about like kind of conspiracy theory thinking as a rite of passage, because then you begin to trust something else. It's like that, going back to the more creative demonic vibe type language. And so I think there's good reason right now that, the spectacle, all this gaslighting, there's just kind of conspiratorial movement happening. And I think it has something to do with this.
Very good. Yeah, it seems that there's structural issues that need to be talked about as well, because a lot of people make money off this. I mean, Matt Taibbi talks about this in Hate Incorporated. I mean, there seems to be ethics. I don't know how it's going to be done to stop social media and news industry from pumping all of this stuff up.
And the last thing I'll say there, I think it's about like the response is to be in relationship with people you live for, people you love. Yeah. Get really tight with them, and then build up from there. Because that's where the trust comes from.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter.
All right, Jorge. We'll say we'll end this in 5 minutes. So just after this question, we'll move to Thomas Wynn.
Just two quick. Well, thanks, Peter, for such a wonderful presentation. Just two quick observations. We've been living in Asia for a while now, and people here. This is regarding the sort of like being scared of being foolish and all of these things with your art creation and all of that. Basically, here like the older people, not only the older people, but a lot of people likes to act extremely foolish because it's so embedded in their culture that this foolishness or this kind of like crazy wisdom, the wise old man is embedded that everybody likes to act like that. And whereas in Europe for sure is not like that. It's these sort of like different cultures approaches these things, and how always to find this balance between actually not giving a fuck about what the other person thinks and about being genuine and about caring for others. There is always a very delicate balance there. And so I'm just wondering, if in the Stoa with all the tribes, things that you are looking into, if there is something that you guys are maybe looking or considering, and this sort of like a global different perceptions of otherhood, basically. And also, regarding to the thing about artists and interaction with artists and different medias talking to each other and all of this sort of like communication. I mean, unfortunately, as you know, the sort of like commercial galleries and the whole sort of like industry of art, which moves a lot of money and is what really moves the art world, is the relationships between artists most of the times is extremely competitive. And there is no much room for such sort of like interaction. Unfortunately, you have to move, as you said, like maybe the story looking into these sort of like small communities and things that they are able to keep a relationship which is not so competitive, not so much. It's more like philosophia, not philonaikeia in a way. So, and I think this is something also that, I don't know, this is still kind of like looking into these kind of like little pockets when it comes to art things in relationship with businesses.
Some quick responses. What's the first thing that you said? What was the first?
It's about the foolish, the acting, the perception of others, and how to navigate and negotiate that into sort of like a global world where you have so many things, so many different cultures that they are kind of like sort of like articulating this in so differently.
Right. And I do think it's important to know, like, there's this concept of wisdom signaling, like someone who's like perhaps not wise, but they're pretending to be wise. And there's also like foolish signaling, like it's like, oh, I'm crazy wisdom, I'm a holy fool. Like, it's like, okay, you just like, are you?
Of course.
So that's one thing that comes up. And then I do, admittedly, there's like a Western bias that I have with the Stoa and kind of the tribes that we've searched, because I'm in Canada and all the people I live for live in a Western country as well. But the one thing, there's something that came up, maybe being tired, but what was the last thing again?
About the art market, basically, kind of like ruling the art world and how to navigate sort of like competitiveness. Because, you guys were talking about the communication between different medias and different artists, how to share, how the language of artists are sharing. But there is also the negative part of it, which is really related to the business part of things.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And again, I think I would go to like what do we mean by art here? I really like Philip Reef's notion of death works. He describes it as a work of art that undermines the sacred and fragments people further. So like a Katy Perry pop song as an example. And you can contrast that with life works, works of art that promote the sacred. And if we're going to use sacred as like Durkheim's notion as something that unifies people, like brings people together, that's what I'm interested in, is creating art that brings people together. This is not to say it's kumbaya, everyone's going to come together, right? But just the people that you live for, or the people that are called to live for you, will make them come together. And there's something about creating art in the market economy that like kind of bastardizes in order to become like a death work rather than a life work. So that is sort of the art of an artist of life, in my opinion. How do we navigate the market economy, deal with money, make money, but still create life works? So that's at my edge. right now.
Mhm.
All right. I think yeah, let's start Thomas Wins at the top of the hour. So we've got three minutes there, and I just, yeah, I appreciate this this extra time with you, Peter. I think this has been incredibly helpful to get an overview. I'd be interested in a little free association around this idea of how would you interpret the difference between the wisdom web and less foolish? Is there a meaningful distinction you're trying to point at there? Which might be, and then if secondly, I could get a riff on, do you have any tips or tricks that you've learned for the difference between focusing on relationships over propositions and maybe some of the drawbacks that can emerge in doing that? Or otherwise.
Can you repeat the last part? I was
Just what tips and tricks have you learned? Because in the distinction between focusing on relationships over propositions,
yes.
That's the main distinction.
So yeah, two things. Like this wisdom web, I'm most interested in them out of every like mimetic tribe that's emerging, but I still keep a little bit distant. They have this course, for example, called More Wise, and I'm like, I think that's the wrong move. I don't think we should try to be more wise. I think we should try to be less foolish. Because it's like, what's the opposite of wisdom is foolishness. And then, I'm a kind of a hyper minimal Stoic. So the Stoic principle of via negativa, focus on what you don't want to happen in order to, move towards what you do want to happen. So my art form is try to become less foolish. And first, in order to do that, I have to admit how foolish I actually am. And it's being shoved in my face daily. And then the idea is maybe I can inch my way to more wisdom. And so I think the failure mode of a lot of people in the wisdom web is they're going to put a target on their back, like talking about wisdom, and then they're going to get criticized for how unwise they potentially are. So I think it's wiser, or maybe just more clever, to be less foolish rather than more wise. And I love propositions. I'm a propositional guy, but I think relations are where it's at. And so, for example, like Cadell and I are engaging in these friendship virtue calls, where once a month we jump on a call with each other, unrecorded. We just kind of share what the messiness of our life, the meta crisis of our life. We hold space for it, and we try to engage in philosophical inquiry to become less foolish together. And the last couple of calls, which is really beautiful, like you just kind of like shifted something in me last time, and hopefully I'm holding a space for you well enough. So I think that type of relationality is going to be important. And how can we create conditions, cultures, attractors to make these type of relationships happen? Because I think that's where the art comes from in the middle.
Yeah, I think we've got a pretty good bromance going on. So I'm not, thank you so much for your time. I love this, and I'm gonna stop the recording here.